What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
The Redstone Labor Temple and the Mission is a space where for over 100 years, planning has gone down around class struggle. Maybe most famously, it's where a lot of the planning around the San Francisco General Strike of 1934 happens. And in case you are new to that strike, the short version is after cops shot a couple of strikers dead on what organizers dubbed Bloody Thursday in May of 1934, 150,000 workers and 21 unions went on strike in the Bay Area, and the Longshoremen's Union led the strike, which eventually translated to people working in the ports of SF, LA, and other West Coast ports, winning shorter hours and better pay. This was years before the U.S. legally had a minimum wage. More recently, it was where a lot of the planning to stop the gentrification bomb, known as the Monster in the Mission, which was a planned market rate complex at the 16th and Mission BART Plaza that would have pretty much only been affordable to rich people coming in from outside of the city. The Monster in the Mission and Maximus Real Estate were defeated about 10 years back. Maybe you know that there is no rent control in the city on commercial rents, and landlords definitely want to keep it that way, and they have help from politicians like Mayor London Breed, who recently decided to celebrate landlords by offering tax breaks to companies renting commercial space downtown while showing no love to people who have rented for years at the Redstone. And instead, she is busy crying tears for companies like the one based in Paris, Unibail, Rodamco, Westfields, which stopped making property payments on the Westfield Mall downtown. They'd been paying next to nothing to rent the land underneath the mall, land that is owned by the San Francisco Unified School District. Meanwhile, she's out here making a public statement every time San Francisco loses a J. Crew or a Whole Foods. Now, the Redstone is at risk of being replaced by its landlords with an AI startup hub for tech companies. Tiny from Poor magazine and Rick Gerharter, a movement photographer who's had an office in the Redstone for decades, talk about the significance of the Redstone and gentrification in the city after the shortest little break. Would you mind introducing yourself and talk about how you ended up at the Redstone?
My name is Rick Gerharter. I've lived in the city for almost 50 years and been a photographer for 30-some years. And the reason I'm in the Redstone, I was living in Bernal Heights in a larger apartment with 2 roommates and a big backyard. And there was space for a dark room, which I needed at the time, and an office space. And then when we got evicted, I no longer needed the dark room because of digital, but I still needed an office space because fortunately, a longtime friend offered his room as a place to live, even though it's a very small 2-bedroom apartment. So I absolutely needed another space for, my files, plus I have a lot of other stuff in my office, a lot of books, a collection of camera knickknacks.
I know you from some of the protest actions. Mm-hmm. I have definitely seen you around. I'm not sure if we properly met in person, but I've appreciated seeing you out there over the years at actions happening in the Mission.
Yeah.
Especially anti-gentrification actions.
The bread and butter of my work, the consistent client that I've had is the Bay Area Reporter. And they've covered things in the Mission. The focus of the paper is the queer community. That certainly has impacted queers in the Mission. There were quite a few gay-oriented organizations as such here in the Redstone, several of which have left. But this building, too, has a really rich history of, of course, union history.
So you ended up there and you've been there since...
I guess 18 years, I think I've been here.
Nice. Speaking of the history, could you offer us some of that history? Like, when did the Redstone open? Where does the name come from?
Well, let's see. I don't know exactly when it's open. It's over 100 years old, like maybe 105, around in there. It was built as a labor temple and offices for labor unions. and maintained that for decades up until, well, even when I moved in here, there was still one union headquarters here, the taxi. I forget what it was called, but the taxi union, the taxi drivers union. So it has maintained, that aspect of it up until just recently. And then as the labor unions moved their offices, primarily due to one building manager, Roger Harriet, who was here for many, many years. He's gone now. But he made a real effort, and successfully for the most part, to only hire to community organizations, individual artists like myself, theater groups, and, really worked, like I said, successfully to maintain, that mix of tenants in this building. And, that even in the short time that Lakeside has owned it, a lot of people have left. There's a lot of vacancies. I'm very curious to see who they rent it to.
Yeah, speaking of like the idea of the labor temple, I guess temple is not like a word that when I heard the name of the Redstone, like I immediately associated the term temple with labor.
Really, not a synagogue?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has evokes something religious to me, but the labor temple was something that exists in a lot of cities across the country, thanks to organizing during, I guess, the early 1900s.
Yeah, like I said, this building is about a little over 100 years old. It's actually two buildings. There was an annex. The original building, I believe, is larger, and then they put an addition onto it. I forget when, but a few years later. And of course, it was really active during the general strike in the 30s.
Yeah, could you talk about the general strike?
I know it. Roger, the guy who was the building manager, he's really done a lot of work on the history, and the Redstone Labor Tenant Association has produced, mostly through Roger's work, a booklet and some history of the building. And apparently, as I understand it, it was primarily an office space for craft unions, for more skilled, more conservative unions. And the more industrial unions had other labor temples. Here in the Mission, there was one like around Guerrero and 14th that burned down. And if you look carefully, there's still a number of union offices in the Mission. There's still that history here. And supposedly, during the general strike, that the unions in the Redstone building were sort of late to the game and joined it ultimately, but they certainly didn't initiate it, which was, the longshoremen initiated that strike. And then it turned into a general strike.
Right.
The two guys got shot down there at the Boulevard Cafe.
You mentioned the longshoremen initiated this 4-day general strike in San Francisco that encompassed multiple different trades and involved thousands of people.
Retail was shut down and people got vouchers if they had to go to work or if they, had to buy things. No, it was pretty major. And they won. The longshoremen got what they wanted and have continued to be a very strong progressive union.
Right. And as you said, what kind of precipitated the general strike was this very dramatic moment where two protesters were shot.
Yeah.
And so the 4-day general strike only came after, many days of strikes that were happening maybe in more isolated incidents. And then this big general strike that kind of shut the city down was the result of collaboration between a bunch of different trades.
The National Guard was on the waterfront. It was very moving to see some footage of this huge march, silent march that they had after the guys were shot. It's quite moving.
And since that moment in 1934, where the Redstone became like a temporary HQ for the organizing around the general strike, and then also what came after with negotiations between the unions and the city and then various companies that they were dealing with. Like you said, it it has continued to be a space that has rented more towards people who are doing work that has like a local focus. Is that true?
Yeah, that's certainly some of it. But there's, like the International Indian Treaty Council was here for many years, and there was a lot of statewide environmental activity that came out of this building. So I would not say it's much broader than local. Certainly local is part of it. My work is mostly local, for example, the photography work I do, but I've sold, all over the world over the years.
Do you find like San Francisco offers like a pretty decent setting for photos?
Be a freelance news photographer. There's not many of those around. And it could only happen in a community like San Francisco that so much happens. And specifically in my case with the gay community. And, my career was really, got off to a pretty strong start because I started right at the time of ACT UP, which was a very visual, it was a lot of activity. It was very visual and photogenic. And it was of international interest in some cases. So the market that I had for some of those photos was much beyond the Bay Area Reporter. And that kind of sustained me. And I did a lot of work for unions too. I have over the years, which was always more lucrative because it was usually an hourly rate. Took a lot of photos of people at work.
So for people who don't know, do you want to say a little bit about ACT UP and its work in SF?
Yeah, it stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And it was a grassroots movement worldwide. Very strong chapters in many cities, including San Francisco and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and New York, really all of Paris. And it was to, it was grassroots. There was no real national or international coordination. Some that sort of revolved around international AIDS conferences, but it was a direct action movement to get the government to respond to the crisis. Essentially in various ways, in the prison, with women, with non-white people, with drug users, with gay men, all these different, and San Francisco's sort of profile of the epidemic was a bit unique because internationally the epidemic is mostly among straight men, right? And not really among gay men. And that wasn't true in San Francisco. By far the bulk of the cases and of the deaths were among gay men. So the ACT UP was in response to that awful situation and the absolute, criminal neglect of the federal government and local governments too, but taking the lead from the federal government in discrimination and not, providing resources and all sorts of nasty things. And it had some very major actions, here in San Francisco and also in New York, Washington, the FDA headquarters, different national marches on Washington. And I photographed a lot of that. I traveled, to Washington several times. I went to, 6 or 8 international AIDS conferences in various places around the world.
Yeah, I just got to speak to my friend Deej was at the,
I know Deej.
The first ever blockade of Golden Gate Bridge, which happened in response to the government's lack of response around.
And that wasn't ACT UP.
Right.
That was Stop AIDS Now or Else.
Which I love that name. Yeah.
Yeah, I really do it now. And it was done very secretively, obviously, so that they could get to the middle of the bridge to stop it. Fortunately, it was foggy. Would have never worked if it wasn't foggy. But it was foggy that day. It was in January, I think last day of January. And they asked one photographer, me, and one videographer to go out there and photograph it. So people didn't have their phone cameras at that point. And so basically the only photographs from the action are mine. And I sold them, which was the original plan. I mean, this procedure now is different, of course, but I took the actual rolls of film to the AP office in Fox Plaza, and they developed them and published them and then circulated them worldwide, I guess. I don't know where they all went, but I know they did get published around the world.
So cool.
Yeah, it was. It was a very dramatic action. And, the Bay Bridge has been blocked several times since then. Yeah, Stipe's Now or Else did some very clever actions. They interrupted the opening of the opera,
Right.
big highlight of the social season here in San Francisco. I photographed that. Very dramatic, nonviolent. Although some of the patrons at the Opera House were just like beaten up on the activists. Really nasty,
In their tuxes?
In their tuxedos, yes. And I'll never forget Charlotte Maillard Swig, who was like the chief of protocol, and she's since died. But, like big hotshot society person in town for years and years and years. And she was, I don't know if she was the real hostess of the night, but she was certainly involved in the opening of the opera. And she came out into the lobby. There's like 4 or 5 steps from the lobby into the auditorium of the Opera House. And she was standing at the top of those 4 steps and just looked so angry and so like crestfallen that her big party had been shit upon. Yeah, I'll never forget that.
Definitely want to check out that photo. Yeah, wondering like, what do you find makes for good material in a protest action when you're thinking from a visual aspect?
Well, signs help, signs help. Color, look for color, sign. Like die-ins were quite visually strong when people would die in, and then, they'd draw chalk outlines around people.
Yeah.
By the federal building there was, what was that called? The AIDS Vigil, the vigil.
With the Redstone, what happened in 2021? Could you tell the listeners with Lakeside coming in?
Well, the building had been for sale. MEDA, the Mission Economic Development Association, looked at it very seriously.
So they're a nonprofit in the mission,
right?
Just for people who don't know, that is interested in developing buildings to make it into low-income housing, for example. So sorry, I cut you off, but they were looking at acquiring the Redstone for a minute. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's good to give some background. And, primarily they work with residential situations. So this commercial was a bit different for them, but they looked at it very seriously. They had like engineers come to the quality of the building and, the condition of the building and all this stuff. Because the building had been neglected for years. It really had. The landlord was very neglectful, was very, not hands-on. I never met him. And so the building, it does need, and, still does need a lot of work. Lakeside's done some.
Sorry. So the landlord before that, was there ever a time, do you know, when the building was, I don't know, more like cooperatively, like, you hear a lot about like land trusts nowadays. Do you know if that was ever
not that
a
I've
thing?
heard in the history of it? No. Yeah. We talked to them. We talked to some land trust people about the situation. But the effort that got the furthest was MEDA. And they couldn't raise the money. And, I really fault the city because the city did not come through at all. They came through, I think, with $150,000. And, the bottom line here is this community space will be lost. Absolutely. There's Lakeside is moving it to market rate with the legacy tenants. And so this building will no longer be a cheap place for community organizations. And, I said, the city, I really fault the city because they couldn't come up with whatever, to actually buy the building and keep it the way it is.
I think it's pretty absurd. Like the city has been basically paying the rent of some of the commercial real estate renters in downtown and finding money for that. But it sounds like not finding the same kind of money for the Redstone. What does market rate look like in terms of what people are paying now versus what the new rent is set to be?
Apparently, they're renting the spaces for $300 to $350 a square foot. Now, my situation, I can give you the figure. I don't know much beyond my figures, but my space is, 93 square feet. It's small. Just trying to find it out exactly.
Like you said, I mean, it seems pretty necessary if you got a roommate at home and the kind of work that you're doing, which is really amplifying the work of so many different social movements throughout the city over the years.
Yeah.
I know that journalism is in the pits. Like, I personally know this because I have been a freelance journalist for past 15 years, and it is a ghost of what it once was, the world that I was working in more like straight news. But yeah, the work that people are doing in the Redstone, it has a value beyond just the capitalist extraction model of businesses that you might think of in, say, like the tech industry.
So my figures, my space is 293 square feet. I was paying 465. They gave me and many other tenants a 25% rent increase, which makes it 581. And a lease, which I don't mind and have had them before. And I just looked at the lease briefly today. They want, I was told that market rate for my space would be $1,100. And I'm paying $581, almost $600. Oh. And I don't know. In the discussion I had with a representative from the building manager from Lakeside last week, he said he would like to get the rent for this space up to $750 a month, $750 a month. And as I looked at the lease today, it's $800 a month. And, you know, it's highlighted. So I assume that those are like negotiable, because I told him flat out that this is the representative from Lakeside. I told him flat out, if you continue with those rent increases, you're forcing me out of here. You know, I'm mostly on a fixed income, which is Social Security. I'm almost 72. And you're forcing me out. And, you know, of course, you know, the Lakeside says, oh, you know, we want the legacy tenants and want to respect the history and all this bullshit. And yet the reality is they're real estate investors, and all they want to do is make money. And, you know, and the bottom line, of course, is money, money, money. And if we can sort of preserve a building and provide office space that's needed, that's a sort of a secondary and the purpose of what we do, but it's not the goal of what we do. So, you know, with those sorts of rent increases, and how often are they going to come? Is there going to be another 25% when they want a 1-year lease? So another 25% in a year. In addition, they're establishing 2 fees, which apparently are best practices in the commercial real estate world, which the previous owner never did. One is a prorated, they call it rentable space. It's a prorated charge for the public space in the building, the hallways, the bathrooms, the elevator, things like that, prorated to my square footage. And the second fee and the representative did say that they were going to try to waive that rentable fee for legacy tenants. Well, for how long? And then the second fee is what a common area maintenance fee, which he said is around $60 to $70 a month. And that's but as it says, common maintenance. So, you know, I figure that this 25% rent increase is only the first, and that their effort, and there's really no restriction on them. The laws for commercial real estate for tenants are virtually non-existent. Thanks to Willie Brown, when he was in the assembly, his hands is all over the restrictions on commercial rent control when he was Speaker of the Assembly. And so where does it end? Where does it end? And, you know, I'm certainly not in a unique position here. Many of the tenants have left, which they don't, you know, it's to their advantage. As I was saying, they think market rate for this space is $1,100. So they don't care if I leave or not. It's to their advantage that I get out of here.
Right. So in San Francisco, obviously, we have rent control on some of the residential, like you said, as a result of the work of politicians such as our former mayor, Willie Brown, that rent control is restricted for residential buildings that were built prior to the 80s. So any of these new buildings, they, for the most part, are not going to have any kind of rent control. And for commercial spaces, so like spaces where, Rick, you're making your office, that doesn't fall under rent control at all. And I think it's kind of sad to see that there are a lot of spaces in the Mission, in particular in downtown, as well, but really all around the city, where you have these real estate companies who can afford to leave spaces empty with the, presumption that they will be able to someday in the future, make some huge amount when some tenant comes along with a lot of money in their wallet to spend on market rate rent. And yeah, I mean, that's partially why you see, like, because there aren't these protections, why there's so many empty commercial spaces in the Mission, because you do have a lot of these large corporate landlords who can just afford to sit on these empty spaces as investments.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose there's some tax benefits the way the laws are, totally beneficial to real estate development. And, I'll be very curious to see what their new tenants are like, because this building, which is right, at 16th and Mission, a half a block away, of course, there's a BART stop there. There's excellent transportation, absolutely excellent transportation here. But it's also still a very problematic corner. There's a lot of misery. There's a lot of dysfunctionality on the streets around here. I don't really think it's dangerous. I go through it, twice a day, and often at night, 9:30, 10 o'clock. And I don't feel it's dangerous, as an older man, but there's a lot of misery on this street. And, a lot of people working, if you're some tech bro, I don't think you want to be walking through that twice a day. So I'll be very, very curious as to who will be interested in this space. And like I said, they have done some work, most, as far as I can tell, mostly cosmetic. They improved the front door security. They put in an internet system for us, and they painted the hallways and the vacant spaces. They painted and put in new flooring and done some other work, I'm sure, and some that I'm not aware of, no doubt. But fortunately, my space. I mean, other tenants have had real problems with leaky windows, and fortunately, my space has always been to my satisfaction. I've never used the heater. I've hardly used the overhead lights. So my room, I've never had any problem. In fact, I had really, really simple relations with the previous landlord, and whereas some tenants here, it was very complicated. No leases, people not paying rent, confused leases apparently. But for me, it was all very straightforward.
What's the next move for people in the building? You said that some people, the move was to move out because they are anticipating much higher rents. What are the rest of you who are remaining in the building? What's your next move?
Well, we're renegotiating leases. The lab, which is one of the larger spaces in the building, they have gotten a lease that they can live with. I don't know the details of it. RAP, that has their offices, they've got a lease that they can live with. I've in negotiations about my situation. And, some of the particulars in my situation, given my age, given where I am in my career, it's, I don't need this office space. I do and I don't. I'm in discussions with the library to take the bulk of what, the photos and the personal stuff, which is, I don't know, a third of what's in this room. And I have a lot of books that are in this room.
It's
also
just irritating that you should have to even be faced with that decision, especially considering how much empty commercial is out there.
Including
right
in this
now.
building. Including building.
Yeah. So the lab, their rent went from just under $1 a square foot to $1.92 a square foot, according to KQED article that I looked at a little earlier. So that's like doubling for this performance space. That's like on the main, I guess it's like maybe the second floor of the building.
And it has a street entrance.
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah.
It's like, there's a really quirky building. There's mezzanines. If you ever saw the movie, is it Being John Malkovich? This building is sort of like the building that was in Being John Malkovich. There's these like little hidden spaces that are only on part of it. Part of it is because there are several large meeting halls. Being it was a labor temple, there were several large meeting halls. So those take up 2 floors but not the entire floor plan. So you have these it's a very quirky building. It really is. And, you want $1,600 deposit. I've only been a small business person for 30 some years and have paid my bills, never defaulted on my rent. So I'm going to try to get that down, if not eliminate completely. There's an AA group in the building, and apparently they wanted a deposit of $5,000 from them.
Wow.
Which,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know exactly how AA groups work, but I doubt that they have much of a budget at all. I never answered your last question, actually.
Yeah.
What are we going to do next? And well, maybe I did. I guess what we're doing now, we have very little power. I don't feel that our conditions are strong enough that we're going to go on a rent strike. So what else can we do? Is try to get the best lease conditions that we can and go from there. And have to accept the fact that the space is lost.
Yeah. So, I mean, in an ideal world, like you would have maybe the city step in, you would have rent controls that applied to people who have been in spaces for very long time doing work that I would say benefits the community in a way that's hard to measure just using dollar bills.
Yeah, people like us, it's like, it's obvious. It's why the city is as vibrant as it is. It really is.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm so glad for me personally that this didn't happen 20 years ago. Because, at my age, I'm in good health, fortunately, even though I did hit a heart event last year, which required a bypass surgery. But I'm in good health and anticipate living quite a bit longer. But I don't need this space to do that. I don't need this space for my photography career. And so I need it for other reasons, actually, partially because my apartment's so small, and my roommate's home almost all the time. He's retired too, and he's always home. And It's cold in the wintertime. It's so cold. And my office here is much warmer. I can heat it up nicely. This is such an example of how the city has really not risen to the need. The city has really fallen down. And I don't know, why it's the city's responsibility, perhaps, but I don't know whose else it is. We certainly don't have that sort of wealth among the tenants. And, I know that, no tech bro sugar daddy came to our rescue. So I just fought this, and I suppose, the supervisor, who was Hillary Ronan, played a role or did not play a role in trying to do it. I was not involved in any discussions with her. Some people were. I know that her office has certainly been aware of this, all of them, and they were involved a bit more, perhaps, when Meta was interested in it. The city basically promotes real estate development. It doesn't try to hinder it. The rules for these buildings are all over the place. The so-called affordable apartment options are not affordable to me, but they are below market rate. So I think that's a bit more accurate way to describe it. And now the building which they will build, hopefully, at 16th and Mission will be 100% market rate, like you said.
100% below market rate.
Yeah, below market rate, not market rate.
Yeah. And I mean, sorry.
That will be just within, say, a block and a half, 2 blocks of 16th and Mission. I believe there's 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 housing developments that were not originally intended to be 100% below market rate. But because the Mission got so upset, and screamed enough, that they're all now 100% below market rate.
Yeah.
Mayor Lee, the building directly next to east of the Redstone, on the corner of South Van Ness and 16th. When Mayor Ed Lee was mayor, he sort of, I guess he had the power to decide that was going to be all market rate or below market rate.
I know that you said a lot of people at the Redstone were involved in the organizing against the monster and the Mission. And I have to assume that had the Redstone instead been filled with offices, of new startups, the people in those offices would not have shown up for community in the same kind of way that the tenants currently at the Redstone did. So that's like another way that community loses if the Redstone it all goes to market rates and everyone is forced to leave.
One other thing I touched on briefly earlier, that when the city was discussing with these developers of the buildings at 16th and or South Van Ness and Mission, was it ever discussed, well, can you buy the Redstone? Because I believe that their discussions happened before Lakeside bought it. I mean, I could be wrong on that. But was that ever in the mix of discussion that, well, maybe you could buy the Redstone or subsidize enough for the Redstone so, we could maintain it as a community space?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that is a good question. I mean, we're in the city where there's more billionaires per capita than anywhere else in the US. There is wealth around us, and it's just, what
there's always been a wealthy city.
Yeah. What kind of city do we want? And is the city going to put, energy behind the values of people like the people who are currently at the Redstone?
Very true.
Cool. Thank you again.
Okay, well, see you on the streets, presumably.
All right. Sounds good. Yeah, definitely. Could you speak a little bit about the work that you do with Poor Magazine and Homefulness?
Sure. Well, always starting by honoring my mama, Afro-Boricua ghetto scholar, for without whom there'd be no me. A disabled, houseless survivor by any means necessary. Me and her dealt with homelessness throughout most of my childhood and young adulthood. LA, Frisco, Oakland, and wherever else we would hide under a doorway or a bus bench and hope that the pigs would not be picking us up or police harassing them, which they often did. When you're outside, your lives are exposed. You struggle with the violence of exposure, as I call it, rather than the privilege of privacy. Mm-hmm. Also honoring First Peoples of this land. We are on occupied Ohlone Lishan territory, both in Uchim, aka Oakland, and Frisco, Yalamu. And the same ish is happening, the same shit 530 years later. And our relatives are still here fighting and actually walking with us as we unsell Mama Earth and try to build a homefulness. Poor Magazine's been working on what I don't think we're on the FCC dial, so I'm going to say it, gentrification.
Yeah.
I can't say that on PNN KXU radio because we got that little weird FCC paper. But anyway, yeah, we've been doing it since the beginning of Poor because you could argue a lot of, because we're a poor people-led movement, basically Poor Magazine is a poor people-led, indigenous people-led movement. We don't really call ourselves an organization. We keep the paper by any means necessary because folks with race and class privilege are afraid to radically redistribute to poor people. They think you want to go to Mexico with $20 or something, right? But so we got that paper. We got our, all our paperwork in line, but we're a movement and making sure that the voices of poor and houseless people are leading the work for poor and houseless people. But as a movement led by poor people, we're entwined with our movement when there's no weird false separations. And so Poor Magazine, the movement has been gentrified and evicted and houseless along with its co-founders over the years, starting with its inception on the street. Yeah. When meanwhile we're still sleeping in our car and sleeping on doorways and bus benches back in 96. And at that point, starting with 98 and 99, we're dealing with what I call gerification, the Jerry Browns and the Willie Browns and both sides of the bay, evicting people right and left in the so-called dot-com boom, right? And we've been fighting that from the gate. And then moving on to 2010, Mama House, which was one of the solutions we came up with as poor houseless mamas, was evicted from the mission from behind a $700 rent increase. And it was in 2009, 2010 that we started the Gentrification Tours, RS, which is a cultural art and creative poetry, spoken word resistance to the violence of removing people. And we've been untouring the mission ever since. Saying untour because tourism itself is an extractive industry that leads to the removal of poor people from an area. So we're untouring, which means that meant going into the hipster enclaves as a group, and just leading an on tour, and in the restaurants where they were sitting. And nobody got hurt. We're always a peaceful movement. We're just spreading the information that they're having $100 meal on the graves, if you will, of elders, of Black and Brown Indigenous elders who used to be able to live here.
Yeah.
But for their presence, they cannot. And so, fast forward to now, it's like mind-numbingly insane. You've got People's Park in Berkeley setting up a prison outdoors to incarcerate a park. You've got, the politrickster in charge in Frisco, basically sweeping any human who's dares to be seen if they're houseless and making it illegal for poor Indigenous people to sell some product on the street.
Right.
This way we can make some money. Me and Mama somos vendedores. That's what we were for years. That's what poor families do. And had it not been for the street vending we did, most of the time without a license, because we could not afford the fucking license fee as poor people. But then even with the license, eventually, and then we couldn't keep because it was too expensive, but whatever, we were harassed all the time. And now making it illegal in the mission, the so-called user-friendly politrickster, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And basically corralling people who were vending on the street in the mission, which people are continuing to do in spite of this crackdown, but trying to corral people into these spaces that they've leased from landlords and saying, okay, well, if you're going to do it, we're going to put you in this space that nobody really knows is there and, is not particularly public or very visible from the street. And so you're basically not going to make any money if you decide to be secreted away in this little hidden spot that we've decided that if you're going to vend, you must vend here. And yeah, thank you so much for everything you just offered. And it's, always good to hear from you, like getting an education about some of the work that's been done over for much longer than I have been around. I came to the city in 2006. I was heartened on the People's Park point, though I guess the Berkeley supervisor who sort of brokered the deal to sell out People's Park stepped down. He said it was because of harassment, but I'm going to read that as because of direct action that he decided that it was too hot for him to stay in the seats after he had sold out People's Park, this beloved space that for many, many years has been a place where people could not only go and in some cases find some reprieve from the cops because there's community around, but also just have a point from which to do a lot of activism from over the years. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Redstone, and I was wondering if you could talk about your first experience at the Redstone.
Well, it's interesting that it seems like everything's fitting together like a beautiful puzzle. So in 2010, when we launched the gentrification tours, RS, and shout out to my brother Motiado Silencio and Marlon and Junebug and so many other Queen Nandi and other relatives in Poor Magazine, all badass writers and poets, creators, poverty scholars, most and foremost. And I did want to just give a plug for Poverty Scholarship, which is Poor People-Led Theory, Art, Words, and Tears across Mama Earth. We make a lot of media. There's so much crapola that is done supposedly to take care of the homeless problem. But Poverty Scholarship is actually textbook that we poor people created that codifies a lot of the theory, if you will, and I don't use the P word, pedagogy, but theory of poor people's lives and solutions. So we have solutions we need to be listened to. In 2010, actually 2009, after getting evicted and gentrified again out of 7th and Market, because it went through this clean up, hygienic metaphors about poor people's lives, all code for get rid of the homeless people, get rid of the poor people convening. It's called, quote, mid-market, right? That's
right.
Really stricter, right? So we were caught in that nightmare, as is often the case. We put up a big fight and a series of protests, and at the end, they still kicked us out. What else is new? And but the Redstone, in a moment of really absolutely, because we talk about these things now, but eviction kills. And I want to name that. I want to name EYA Irish Canada, 100-year-old Black elder evicted from her home of 40 years in Frisco. I want to name Ron Lickers and Elaine Turner. I want to talk about the violence of eviction and how we at Poor Magazine were able to prove under 368 Penal Code elder abuse that, in fact, eviction is elder abuse. I want to name that because eviction of people who've already been evicted, and they could also add sweeps in there, the violence of sweeping humans like we're trash, is an act of violence. And so for us, we had nowhere to go. As the Poor People-led movement, we had nowhere left in Frisco that we could, except squatting on a corner. But, it does help to have some place where people can get out of the rain and out of the cold and have some food.
Of course.
Organize. And that's what we were. We're poor people organizing, right? So we were hit up by some folks who were like, there's this building where they actually make space for social justice movements. And we're like, what? We didn't know that. And so we went and checked out the Redstone. And they just opened their arms to us. And, real talk, they didn't even charge us rent for a long time, which is such an act of revolution, and there's beautiful people like Western Regional Advocacy Project, Paul Bowden, and those cats always take care of us for years, and we had nothing, a pot to piss in, and, Living Wage Coalition, Carl Kramer, and Edith Stelly Foundation, Isha, and others, and it was like, you got a spot, you home, and I can't stress enough that for small movements, which are what poor people movements are, by the way, and to support grassroots organizing, real talk, having spaces that are safe and actually real and welcoming, literally are the difference between functioning and not. And what were we able to do with that? We had a little kitchen space. We started Family Project, which later became Decolonize Academy, our Poor Mama and Poor Uncle-led liberation school, modeled after the Black Panthers and Zapatistas. We were able to start People School, which is our, de-gentrification, de-talentization seminar, actually, that another plug is coming up next Saturday and Sunday, not this week. People should check it out, www.poormagazine.org.
Yeah, we'll definitely link to a lot of the resources in the show notes for people who are listening.
Yes, but all that to say, we were able to start that, our street newsroom, our sliding scale cafe, we're giving free food away. It was a lot of us deal with a lot of really effed up food as poor people, getting us some healthy food. Our radio studio that allowed Poor People's Radio to end up being launched, which today is PNNKXU, and our journalism department, which to this day is Poor Magazine and Poor Press.
It's huge, and if you have ever been to any of the anti-gentrification, pro-human life actions in the city, there's a good chance that you have had the chance to be there in the presence of Tiny, because as long as I have been active in the Bay, pretty much any action I've gone to, you are there or someone from Poor Magazine is there in the flesh. And I just want to say I appreciate you so much for that. And also for people who maybe haven't been here for very long or could be listening from outside the city, could you describe what the situation, the mission has been over the last many years, I suppose, but in terms of why do we need a place like the Redstone and its relationship to the neighborhood around it, which is, obviously gentrifying, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, plug for the Redstone and plug for what it was. I think last year or less than a year ago, it was bought by these big, really snake developers, as I call them. And it was devastating because they just came in this terrifying way that, removers, as I call them, come in and erase everything that was there, metaphorically, spiritually, but actually, right? It's an old building. I think it's over 100 years old. It was the hub of original union organizing, like Bloody Thursday, back in the way back, if people do their union organizing research. I think there are these kind of weird AI tech monsters who, put a code on the door, so now you can open the door remotely. Like you can be in Dubai and open the door, or right there on the street. Well, that might sound cute and convenient, or what I call convenient. But what that really means is when they want to get rid of you, oh, wow, they just changed the code on your phone. You know what I mean? So, and they did that. They shut us all out for a whole week. They shut down all the internet. I want to shout out to Carl Kramer and Living Wage Coalition because they're holding on by a thread, and they've harassed them intensely. We still have a little office in there. We still do work in the city all the time. Our Roofless Radio project is based in the city, and folks are trying to build a homefulness in Frisco. So it's an ongoing struggle, but it's extremely important that a space like the Redstone continues. There's hardly any life when you take away the community.
Yeah.
Right? These tech people would rather have the Starbucksization of the whole world.
We'll also link to the piece that appeared in both Poor Magazine and 48 Hills that you wrote about the Redstone and what's happening right now. And yeah, if there's anything else that you wanted to offer to the people, please say the word.
Check out poorpress.net. All of the poverty scholars put out beautiful books. I just did a new children's book called Land Back Turkey. I urge people to check it out. It's a graphic novel for all ages. And then a book about when me and Mom were sleeping on the street, and it introduces a new protagonist because we recognize that over 53% of the student population are houseless and housing insecure in San Francisco Unified alone, and 38% in Oakland. So it's a crisis with our young people, and we need to change the way we operate, folks. Check out Homefulness, poormagazine.org/homefulness. We need your support coming to Frisco. We need your support coming anywhere. We're trying to help folks in LA and Tongva build one, and working on one right now, and the second one in Ochan, Oakland. It doesn't happen without radically redistributed dollars. What we believe, right? We can all actually operate together to resist the lie of capitalism. So thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco, which is produced by Toshio Moronic and edited by Tofu Estolas. If you like the show, you can go to patreon.com/San Francisco. That is where all of the past episodes live, and that is also where you can help me out. I am trying to get to 100 subscribers, which at the $5 level would completely cover editing, as well as future transcription, and also the podcast hosting for the show. Stay safe, and we'll be back next week with a new San Francisco.